was reading your a HuffPost article as well on epigenetics, and there was a study in rats found that sons of cocaine-using father rats were resistant to the allure of cocaine. So you ended that article saying that science still had much to learn about how transgenerational epigenetics affects people. And so I'm wondering, because I believe that was written several years ago.
Yeah.
Are we closer to understanding this since the article, since that was written? Because
we're a little bit closer. I would like to point out as well how much fun scientists have sometimes. Like, what inspired somebody to start giving rats alcohol or cocaine? I mean, seriously, imagine going home and describing your working day.
How was your day, dear? Well,
exactly.
I found a brick of meth and I was giving it to a squirrel.
Exactly. It's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah, this is why people go into science. We're starting to get a better handle on how certain things get passed down. And again, almost all the reliable data are from non-human species.
Okay.
And epigenetics plays a role in that, but we have to be very careful. It's not necessarily direct inheritance of epigenetic modifications. It probably has more to do with inheritance of what are called small non-coding RNAs, so little bits of message, that little bits of information encoded in RNA that get passed on from parent to child.
Okay.
And they probably then set up a new pattern of epigenetic modifications. So I think the data are really strong now in loads and loads of species that under the right experimental conditions, you can get this transfer of non-genetic information from parent to child. Where it's really, really difficult to demonstrate is in humans. Again, for exactly the same reasons that we talked about earlier, that we're too genetically diverse, we're too environmentally diverse. So occasionally you do see effects in humans at a population level, but using that to say this is happening in this family or it happened to this individual, I think that will be pretty much impossible ever to show. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, because I would like to argue that if it's happening in all these other species, including other mammalian species, why would we argue that there is something magical about humans that means it never happens to us? But being able to show that it happens to an individual is a very different proposition.
Well, because I guess there's always, some sort of ratio between nature and nurture and all of these things. And I wonder if, let's say you're talking about a drug addicted parent, and then if the child is going to be susceptible to things like that, I can imagine how that would be very difficult to study and quantify, because alcohol specifically, because if a child's growing up in that environment, it's kind of like almost literally monkey see, monkey do. Yeah. So you can't really say, like, unless the alcoholic was the father and the father is absent after the birth of the child, and then perhaps you can get like some isolated, not relevant sample sizes of data.
Exactly.
But it's like you said, it seems to be impossible, and you just have to kind of guess with the information available. Yeah,
pretty much. You would have to do the most extraordinary, large-scale and highly unethical experiments of basically taking newborn infants away from their birth environment and putting them into completely different environments. And even then, I bet you all we would be able to see would be at most a population scale effect, because there's just too much going on in our lives, which is kind of encouraging, because it means that actually very often we're not predetermined, or we're not predestined genetically or epigenetically in terms of how our life is going to turn out. That it has much more to do with the environment that we're living in at any particular time, and all the things that affect that environment. And that's kind of good, because it's easier to change those things than it is to go in and go, oh, I wonder if we can muck about with this person's epigenetic profile.
Right. Yeah, there are so many things that kind of would remove the ability to objectively tell if genetics are, a big changer of behavior over time.
And we have to be really careful as well, because we have a tendency to go, oh, there's a difference between those two groups. Must be due to genetics. Let's look for the genetic signatures.
Right.
And that's not what's happening at all. So if we look in the UK, for example, people of colour were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And it would have been very tempting to go, let's look for the genetic signatures. But actually it was to do with poverty and social class. It wasn't to do with genetics. And a very similar thing if you look at sudden infant death syndrome. So it was recognized a while back that the rates of sudden infant death were much lower in the UK in people who came from families that had originated in the Indian subcontinent than they were in white British families. And again, it would have been very tempting for experimenters to go, oh, there must be big genetic differences underlying cot death. What it turned out to be was whether or not you put your baby down on their front or on their back when you put them to sleep. And that was a cultural thing. And so we have to be incredibly careful when we look at anything in humans, not to go, I've got a genetic analysis tool, therefore I will analyze everything genetically. We need to have a much wider way of looking at questions than that, because it's really easy to get carried away by genetics, especially these days when it's so cheap to do sequencing.
Right. And if you're someone, like you said, that really depends on science to have all the answers, then maybe you'll dismiss a lot of the environmental factors that of which we have billions and trillions of combinations.
Absolutely.
Like if you're looking, let's say, even at a child that's 8 years old, and you don't know that let's say that they were molested or have some sort of real trauma in their life, well, that's obviously going to affect their behavior and how they view the world and how they interact with the world. But if you're assuming like, oh, this must be because their mother ate too much cheesecake when she was pregnant, well, then like you're kind of just you think you're playing God to be able to predict all of these things, whereas I think it's the kind of the infallibility of our species in which we just can't know everything, and we try as we might, but we'll always come up a little short, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I love the statement, I can't remember who made it first, that the human brain is the most complex 1.5 kilos of matter in the entire universe. And trying to think that we can run simple tests on that and we will come up with really easy explanations, I just think is completely fallacious. You know, I don't